Hello and welcome to the book conversation series that's part of the United States and the World Workshop at Syracuse University's Maxwell School. My name is Usama Khalil. I'm a professor of history at the Maxwell School and the host and coordinator of the workshop series. My guest today is Dr. Deepa Kumar. She's an award-winning scholar and social justice activist. Dr. Kumar is a professor of media studies at Rutgers University. Her critically acclaimed book, Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, has been translated into 5 languages in the fully revised an updated second edition titled Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, 20 years since 9/11, marks 20 years of the war on terror. She has authored more than 80 publications, including books, journal articles, book chapters, and shared her expertise in a number of outlets, including the New York Times, BBC, NPR, USA Today, the Danish Broadcasting Corporation, Telesur, and of course, many other national and international news media outlets. Dr. Kumar, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I want to hold up a copy of the book, which is out and available through Verso Press. It's just like the original. It is amazing. And I want to congratulate you on not just the success of the first book, but of course, of having this updated and revised edition. So, you know, and I can't thank you enough for being here, but this was, and as you know, obviously a successful, very successful and timely book when it was first released. What surprised you about the book's initial reception, and what's, I guess, surprised you since?
Yeah, so I actually wrote this book in the hope that it would be useful for people trying to make sense of anti-Muslim racism in the war on terror era, right? So there's a lot of knowledge thanks to the civil rights movements, thanks to various Latinx movements and so on, of racism as it applies to other groups, but not necessarily around the racialization of Muslims and not necessarily an understanding of Islamophobia. So since 9/11, this has been an issue that I've been thinking about. I had been writing about short pieces, and I had been an activist around, you know, and trying to organize and educate people around this issue. So I'd hope that this book would help those who were trying to make sense of this have a big picture of what Islamophobia is, why it's a particularly pernicious form of racism, and how to understand it, and more importantly, how to push back against it. And that did have, you know, that hope was realized in the form of very brisk sales of the book. It was used in activist communities. It was bought by people who are not scholars. It was translated, as you said, and read around the world. And so I was very happy that this happened. And my publisher was also rather surprised that it sold as many copies, because they saw it as an academic book, right? Whereas I saw it as a kind of crossover book. Now, what surprised me was the warm reception that the book actually got within the academy. Right, so I was invited to give dozens of lectures all over the US, but also in the UK, in Australia, and so forth. And there were a variety of departments that were inviting me: religion, English, political science, history, Middle Eastern studies, South Asian studies, terrorism studies, communication, and so on. You were one of the people who invited me as well as part of the Maxwell School. And that surprised me, that the book would be interesting to people in that many disciplines. And these were not small talks, right? They were talks with packed audiences of students, sometimes community members, faculty for whom this was not their area of research, because everyone was trying to make sense of the world that we were living in. And it later occurred to me that the reason the book had so much academic appeal, as someone put it, was the right book at the right time, right? That is, there was a need for somebody to pull together insights that had already been developed in all these disciplines. And I saw this book really as a book to explain the world, not necessarily as an academic contribution to international relations or to communication and culture, and so on. So I read very widely in a bunch of fields and tried to put all of these insights together. And that's what made for this appeal across various departments and fields of study and so forth. And so that was a pleasant surprise. And for me, that was, you know, a lesson in how being actively engaged in the world and trying to explain the world and trying to change the world and trying to prevent this form of racism and the proliferation of the war on terror actually leads to very productive forms of analysis that cross disciplines and that don't stick to the limits that various disciplines actually impose on scholars.
So you have, I mean, what many academics dream of, you have this very successful book, and now the publisher comes to you and says, we want you to do an updated edition. And this is a challenge because the first book is so successful. And what I loved about the new book was you took it on. This really is, you know, an updated new edition. So I'm curious, what did you decide? And so, you know, part of the book conversation series is, you know, we focus on new authors, but you're an established, successful author. This must have been a challenge for you. So I'm curious how you went through this idea of what do I keep, what do I leave out, and why?
Right. So my book, scholars who studied this have said that Islamophobia studies as a particular niche actually came into its own only around 2010, 2012. And mine was among the first few books and articles. You know, I'm not the only one, obviously. There are, you know, many people who wrote before that period as well as during that period. But it came into its own in that period. And since then, we've seen a proliferation of a number of excellent books, including your book, America's Dream Palace, which I draw on for the second and revised edition. And so what I set out to do really is to do a couple of things. One, update my analysis to the present moment, that is to the end of the Trump administration. Because a lot of things had happened in the 9 years that I had written the first edition. Two, I also set out to incorporate some of the scholarship and the work that had been done after this book was over, particularly elevating both in the period before and after the work of scholars of color, right? And so that's something I did very consciously. But I would say that the biggest sort of laser focus that I had in practically rewriting the book, and you know, a publisher should never give you a chance to do some edits because you know you never do that. You end up rewriting the book because you're a different person. You know so much more. You know, a decade later, the main focus was really to explain Islamophobia as racism. That's what I did and focused on from beginning to end, because honestly, only a handful of scholars and activists have actually been making this argument, and that's true even today. And so you asked, you know, what chapters keep in, what chapters to take out, and so on. So I started with the very first chapter in the original book, which begins in the 8th century and goes through the medieval era. And at the time, my thinking was that some of the themes and tropes that were developed in the context of the Crusades, as well as the Reconquista, which is the attempt by Spanish rulers in the north to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rulers who had ruled, you know, eventually were expelled in 1492, but had ruled for hundreds of years in the region. So when that begins in the 11th century, there are some really demonic tropes that are developed in relation to Muslims, right? And some of these persist, like the idea that Islam is an inherently violent religion, that Muslims are sexually deviant, and so forth. But when I went back to look at that, and I really burrowed into, you know, the work on the work on the Middle Ages and the relationship between the powerful Muslim empires and the really weak kingdoms that were, you know, Europe back in the Middle Ages, I didn't find evidence for the existence of racism in the modern sense, right? Sure, there were biases, there were prejudices, there were, you know, there's a whole genre of French writing which depict Muslims as monsters, as deformed people. But what's interesting about that genre is also that many of the rulers in these powerful Muslim kingdoms, the way the story would proceed is they were shown as just as noble as the French knights and so forth. And if they converted, they could definitely be accepted into the Christian fold. So there was a way in which Christian universalism didn't create permanent others, and by no means could the Muslim other have been seen as inferior back in the Middle Ages, because, you know, these were advanced empires, far ahead culturally, politically, economically, from the tiny little kingdoms that dotted Europe. In fact, there was no such thing as Europe. So I spent a lot of time reading this and researching this, but in the end, I removed that chapter because I wanted to start the book with the first moment when Muslims start to be seen as a race, and that's really in the early modern era, at the end of the Middle Ages. And so the book starts there and then goes on through, you know, the 18th century, the high point of European colonialism, all the way to the war on terror. So that's the main sort of, you know, shift. And the other thing was to write several new chapters. One of them, the concluding chapter, which I call The Matrix of Anti-Muslim Racism, to explain how race is something that does not exist through time. Sure, we've had, you know, certain biological notions of race associated with Muslims in the early modern era, but it keeps shifting. And it keeps shifting because empires are not the same. Empires look different. And as a result of that, how the Muslim other is constructed, how they are oppressed, and so on, keeps shifting. And that's why it's important, I thought, to provide a matrix which includes think tanks and the political establishment and so on, to understand what are the sources of both structural and ideological anti-Muslim racism, but also what are the sources of resistance, so that this is not a done deal and we can actually fight to end both anti-Muslim racism and empire.
As your title indicates, and as you've already talked about, this is a story about empire. And what I'm curious about, and I think what many will be fascinated by, is in your telling, how is anti-Muslim bigotry and racism inherent to the imperial project, whether it's European or American?
Yeah, so in the second edition, as I said earlier, one of the things that I try to focus on is to look at what are the conditions under which anti-Muslim racism actually emerges and is sustained by. And what my analysis shows really is that the originary moment, if you will, although all racisms borrow from past tropes and past ideas, including from the Crusades and so on, I think that the modern notion of race and of Muslims as a race actually begins in Spain. In Spain, when Spain has emerged as an empire, it has kicked out the Muslims who had ruled for hundreds of years and so forth, and sets itself up as one of the key empires in the era of mercantile imperialism, right? It's Portugal and it's Spain. And the way that things work out in that context is that in order to consolidate a Spanish empire, which in Spain consists of people of various kinds, right? There's no common national identity that is Spanish. And so for Isabel and Ferdinand, who secure their rule over all of Spain, a Christian Catholic identity becomes very important, right? And the Inquisition is a part of actually solidifying internally their imperial control. And it's in this context that blood purity laws actually pushed by old Christians, because they are vying for the jobs that largely Jewish people occupy. These are professional jobs. These are jobs in the court of Ferdinand and Isabella. And by the way, Ferdinand himself has Jewish relatives and so forth. They push for that, which is this notion that even if you convert, if you are Jewish, you are still impure because your blood is impure. And so to kick them out from these positions, the old Christians really pushed for these blood purity laws, which is the first time that something to do with biology is connected to a process by which an entire group is homogenized, right? But there's still no notion of inferiority at this point. You can't see people who are in the court of Ferdinand and Isabel as being inferior. Similarly, Muslims, the same laws are applied to Muslims. And if Jews are expelled in 1492, Muslims are expelled in the early 17th century. Because these same blood purity laws were used. And so I argue that there's a form of proto-racism that develops in the context of Spanish imperialism, because on the one hand, there is this biological notion of race, but on the other hand, when it comes to Muslims, Spain is still emerging as a key power. The Ottomans are massively powerful, right? So are some of the North African kingdoms. So there's no uniform notion of inferiority. And you see that. I'll just give one example and stop there, which is you look at Cervantes's Don Quixote, which is written at the high point of Muslim expulsion. And he has many sympathetic Muslim, converts, including this woman who dresses as a Turkish man and who's respected, and he's going to be killed. They let him/her speak, and they discover she's a Morisca, that is a Muslim who's converted to Christianity, and they're so, impressed by her that the viceroy or the governor invites her to his house, and the whole village comes to meet her. And you think about that, right, for a second. This is the context of mass expulsion, and yet there is this sympathetic portrayal. So that's why I see this as proto-racism, and full-blown racism really only develops in the context of European high colonialism in the 19th century, drawing on Enlightenment notions of race and sort of teleological notions of species of human beings that evolved from the earliest stage, the highest stage, which is European development. Those ideas didn't exist in the Middle Ages. They come into the being in the context of mercantile imperialism and later capitalist imperialism led by Britain.
That's great.
And Orientalism, comes into being as well, which is the key mechanism through which Arabs, Indians, and others are racialized. And it's this composite, racial Muslim.
It's fascinating. And it's a great, I think it's a great shift for this new version. I was struck as I was reading the introduction again, because, obviously September 11th frames this new edition
Mm-hmm.
and the 20th anniversary. And you describe quite vividly, and I think so many individuals can, where you were accosted by a colleague. And so I think, there's often this notion about academia that it is, it's more progressive, it's more open-minded, these are intellectuals, of course, and yet this is where you have your moment, right? That you are, and so, and I'm curious, over the past 2 decades, as we talk about the new version, what has changed about perceptions of the Muslim other, as you referenced, and what has been consistent as you see it in between these lines?
Yeah, so what 9/11 did is it took past ways in which Arabs, South Asians, and other people were seen as others, and created this composite racial Muslim, right? So I became interchangeable with Osama bin Laden because I look Muslim. So even though I'm not actually Muslim, because I look a certain way, I was seen as dangerous, I was seen as threatening, I was seen as not part of, not belonging to the United States. Never mind, I've spent my entire adult life here and I'm an American citizen. But what happened immediately after 9/11 is this process by which, I say in the introduction to the book, and I draw from Albert Memmi, who talks about the mark of the plural, right? Which is where the actions of a handful of people get generalized to an entire group, right? So 19 hijackers, of which 15 are of Saudi origin, now become the basis from which to see all brown-skinned people and all Muslim-looking people and all Muslims as potential terrorists. Now, of course, this has a longer history in the US. I'm exploring this in a book that I'm calling Terrorcraft, which I published an essay on that. But I'll just say this, which is that there are roots, but 9/11 really elevated that. And unfortunately, there was a huge consensus, even among people of color, that the racial profiling of Muslims was the right thing to do. So Keeanga Yamhata Taylor talks about how there was all this work that was done to push back against racial profiling of African Americans. And then 9/11 happens, and that whole debate has, gone by the wayside. And even African Americans are now, now agree that Arabs and Muslims and South Asians should be profiled in this way. So that was the moment of 9/11. And that was how the Muslim other was operationalized by the national security state in various practices, which I'll come to shortly, whether it's the FBI's entrapment program, whether it's surveillance programs, all are based on the idea that you're guilty until proven innocent, right? So that's what's happening in that context. Very little resistance to these notions and to these policies. You fast forward 20 years after 9/11, and we're in a much more polarized climate today. So that there are some people who now have much more deeply entrenched right-wing notions related to Muslims, which are based on conspiracy theories, that they are a fifth column, that they want to take over the US and build, apply Sharia law to everyone and so forth. And those ideas actually gain dominance, start to emerge around the late 2000s and then, after 2010 and so forth. And there's a section of the American public that actually believes that. These are the Trump supporters. And we're talking about tens of millions of people who believe that. And on the other hand, there are those who are much more willing to stand up, particularly when there are blatant attacks on Muslims, such as Trump's Muslim ban. Remember, there were protests at airports and so forth. So I would say the key difference then really is one of unanimity in terms of how to see in the public sphere the Muslim as the enemy versus a much more polarized kind of attitude today. But in terms of policy that targets Muslim Americans as well as Arabs and Muslims and Central Asians and so on, that has not changed very much.
So this is you've raised a really great point, and I want us to come back to it, which is this moment of, as you described it, somewhere around, and it's linked really to the Obama presidency. And part of this is about the role of the right-wing media ecosphere, in particular by Fox, but under the Trump administration, it really starts to expand, driven by Fox, but you also start to get InfoWars and some of those that start to pop. And this idea of constructing a Muslim other that is also a way of criticizing Obama. So it's like this interesting, yes. It's an interesting link.
Yeah, because that's absolutely right. I mean, the way you put it is correct, which is that this theory of birtherism, right? Which is the idea that Obama was not born in the United States, that he was born in Kenya and therefore is not eligible to run for the presidency and so forth. That begins to gain, some currency actually in the late 2000s and the Clinton campaign, when Clinton was running against Obama. But then it, of course, gets picked up by the Republicans and amplified so that even Mitt Romney is talking about, how he is born in the United States, right? Born in the USA. But it's Trump that really runs with this back in 2011 or so. And he's one of the biggest, birtherist advocates. And of course, the idea is also that, around the same time, the notion that Obama is Muslim, he's a secret Muslim, he's actually not Christian, that too gains currency. And in fact, Trump builds on xenophobia, on anti-Black and anti-Muslim racism to enter the presidential race, right? So he and Fox News, as you said, very much, were amplified by building these conspiracy theories So much so that in one rally in New Hampshire, said that he is going to, expel all Syrian refugees, right? Remember, on the grounds that they're forming a secret army to overthrow the US state, and that this is going to make the Trojan horse look like peanuts or what have you. And people just ate that up because there had been a long process of this kind of conspiracy theory passing as fact, passing as truth, passing as legitimate knowledge about the world. So it's not surprising, therefore, that QAnon would gain so much currency and legitimacy, which peddles nothing but conspiracy theories in the Trump era.
And so there's an interesting moment you mentioned, which is the 2008 election. And we have, so we're now 7 years roughly from 9/11. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are not going well, even though the Bush administration is trying to pretend that Iraq has been, and they've been supporting this by the media, that the surge has worked, et cetera. So just to give some context. Clinton is supposed to win the Democratic nomination without much fuss, and Obama is not expected to get this kind of groundswell of support, in part because of notions of American racism. Mm-hmm. Now, what's fascinating is, of course, Clinton plays into this because they uncover this picture of a young Barack Obama
with a turban,
with a turban in Indonesia,
yes,
and the emphasis on his middle name, Hussein.
Yeah.
Right. So Barack Hussein Obama. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because as you mentioned, this gets picked up by the Republicans. And there's this amazing moment in 2008. Clinton has been defeated. Obama is the Democratic Party nominee, and Senator John McCain is his Republican opponent. And at an event, he's confronted by a voter, an elderly woman who says she didn't trust Obama because, quote, he's an Arab. And she seemed to imply not that he was an Arab, but that he was a Muslim. And as you write, which I think, again, is great, these are often conflated. They were conflated over and over again, particularly in this discourse about Islamophobia and Islamophobia as a practice. And so McCain responds, no, man, he's a decent family man and citizen. And I just happen to have disagreements on fundamental issues, but that's what this campaign's all about. He's not, in parentheses, an Arab, right? So what's interesting about this exchange over and over again is that he's been praised for, especially after he died. McCain was praised for this state, what's been presented as a moment of statesmanship, rather than his own overt racism and Islamophobia, right? That you can't be an Arab and a decent man. You can't be a Muslim.
That's right.
So what I'm curious about, and this takes us also back to how you open the book with this moment in academia being accosted, but that the press is also responsible for this. So how is this indicative of Islam? So it also takes us to your last chapter of Islamophobia's presence and acceptance in the mainstream media, and increasingly accepted in mainstream society as acceptable.
Yeah, so that's a great example that you bring up that I reference in the book. And the way I talk about this actually is in chapter 3, which has to do with the ideology of Islamophobia, which is that if Orientalism, which is this way of understanding people who live in North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and so on, is a body of knowledge, which many scholars, including Edward Said, have pointed out, comes into being as a way to justify 19th century colonialism, that actually lives on in various shapes and forms and is revised and revitalized in the War on Terror era, right? So it's not as if stereotypes of Arabs are suddenly developed after 9/11. We have a long history, Jack Shaheen and others have shown, of negative stereotypes of Arabs. And very often, as you say, Osama, the Arab comes to stand in for the Muslim, right? That's even though we know that there are Arab Christians and people who are atheists and people who follow all sorts of religions in the Arab world. But it's important to recognize how we're going into the 2008 campaign, and we now have both a media and a cultural environment where there are certain truisms about Islam and certain truisms about Muslims. And one of them is the idea that these people are a backward, uncivilized, misogynistic, violent group of people, right? And I go through several frames that are used again and again as if it is truth, right? And so that's the problem. It's that, one of the examples I start with in chapter 3 is where religion scholar Reza Aslan has been invited onto CNN, not Fox, mind you, CNN, where the program has a ticker at the bottom which says, is Islam violent, right? And it begins with things that the two anchors believe to be true, which is that Islam is misogynistic, Islam oppresses women, it's violent, and so on. And Aslan tries, by providing evidence, research-based evidence, to show that there's nothing about, for instance, female circumcision, which is uniquely Muslim, but in fact is a much bigger practice in Central Africa, which is Christian majority and so forth. But none of the facts that he provides can move them away from this ideological common sense belief that Islam is violent, that Muslims are bad people, that they are misogynistic and so forth. And so that's the way in which this operates, is that you have certain truth statements that are made either blatantly by some people or subtly by other people, but that's the limit of acceptable discourse. And anything that counters this very narrow framing of how to think about Islam and Muslims is not considered legitimate, so that by the end of it, the two anchors have not shifted even in the slightest, despite a mountain of evidence being provided to them.
So this is perfectly connects to the 9/11 moment. Let's go back 7 years. If you recall, 9/11 has happened, and there is a push from the administration, the Bush administration now. Publicly, they are saying Islam is not the enemy. But as you demonstrate, and others have talked about over and over again, public statements do not match government practice, government policy, particularly from the elements of the national security state. And then again, reinforced, as you just talked about, in the media. So how essentially is Islamophobia weaponized by the Bush administration and successive administrations?
Absolutely. So, it's very clever to disarm criticism by making these statements that Islam is not the enemy, we're not targeting all Muslims, when in fact, under the radar, policies are being devised precisely to do the opposite, right? So immediately after 9/11, you see not only the USA Patriot Act, but you also see systems of surveillance come into being, which build on earlier systems of surveillance all the way from the early 70s and so on, which is based on a very fundamental premise that all Muslims are potential terrorists, and therefore it makes sense to actually spy on these people because we know that they're going to do something bad. That is a fundamentally racializing move, right? Where it homogenizes an entire group of people and sees them as a suspect community. You have systematic mass surveillance of Muslim American communities, which some scholars like Arun Kundanani compare to what the Stasi, right, the East German police actually did to, and this is one of the most repressive, regimes. So it's really comparable to surveillance. And then you look at the FBI's program of entrapment, right? What do? They have over 15,000 informants. They send them into Muslim communities, and they get them to prey on vulnerable populations, right? Typically, what the journalist Trevor Aronson, who was in some depth, says is that typically it's working class and poor, brown and black Muslims who the informant goes, contacts, and says, we've got to carry out an attack. And look what's happening in the world. And so incites them, makes them angry, and usually recruits people by offering massive amounts of cash, right? So in the case of the Newburgh Four, one of the four actually had a brother who was just diagnosed with cancer. They didn't have the money, and the informant said, this agent provocateur said, I'll give you the money to cure him. And so, of course, he goes along with the plan. And even in the last minute, one of the four actually says, these are four African-American Muslim men. One of the four says, it's against my beliefs to target innocent people. I don't want to do it. And the agent provocateur is berating him and saying, it is your duty. And I've already got the machinery, the bombs and so forth. And so they go along. And as they're going to supposedly attack the synagogue in the Bronx, the police snap them, the media are all there and ready to make this yet another terror plot foiled. So all this is to say that whether you're talking about the FBI's entrapment program, you're talking about surveillance, the logic is one of preemptive prosecution, right? Which is, we will get and imprison and detain and deport Muslims because we know they're going to do something wrong. That is fundamentally racist and racializing, right? So you can say all you want about, we love Islam, we think Muslims are great, and this is what Obama did, right? When Obama wins the elections, he's actually drawing on a policy document that says that because Bush and the Bush administration had discredited itself on the international stage with the failed occupation in Iraq in particular, right? And there's already a switch towards hearts and minds and counterinsurgency, and David Petraeus is leading this, David Petraeus being the commander in Afghanistan. And Obama is seen as exactly the kind of person who can re-legitimize US imperialism on the global stage by being a sophisticated orator. So that's what he does. He goes off to Cairo and gives this great speech where he rejects the clash of civilizations thesis, which, the Bush administration had a very strong attachment to. So that's their form of racism. And I can come back and explain what clash of civilizations is later if you want me to. But, conservative Islamophobia takes the form of clash of civilizations. But whereas liberal Islamophobia, the kind that Obama exemplifies, rejects the clash of civilizations, praises the contributions that Muslims have made to world history and so forth, but then entrenches the same practices, right? Whether domestically or internationally. I mean, Obama increased the drone program multifold. I can't even remember how much greater the drone strike program becomes. In fact, that's the key way in which he prosecutes the war on terror. He takes it out, and expands it to Yemen and to Syria and other places. In fact, I'll just read a quick excerpt from the book talking about Obama and the what were called Terror Tuesdays, right? This was a day on which President Obama met with his people to discuss who was going to be killed. So here's how I put it. Drone strikes became the Obama administration's signature mode of warfare. In May 2012, the New York Times revealed that every Tuesday, Terror Tuesdays, Obama met with advisors to determine the list of people to be assassinated using drone strikes, what was known as the kill list. This list sometimes included US citizens like the Yemeni-born cleric Anwar al-Awlaki. In the same drone strike that killed al-Awlaki, actually the week after, his 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, was also executed, right? So here's this kid who's being killed, American kid. At any rate, deep within the Times article, it was revealed that the Obama administration was able to make claims about low civilian casualty counts in drone strikes because it defined as a combatant, because you can only do drone strikes against combatants, it defined as a combatant any military-age male who lived in an area being targeted by drone strikes, unless, quote, there is explicit intelligence posthumously proving them innocent, end quote. Now, such a definition epitomizes racist dehumanization as it exposes tens of millions to a vulnerability to premature death, which is a very important part of racialization. And sadly, as I go on to say, 62% of the American public actually were in favor of these drone strikes. So here you have it, right? You have this idea of innocent until proven guilty, even in how casualties are counted, which is all military age men are fair game to be killed, whether they're doing anything or not. And there you have it. It's they're fair game to be killed.
Well, I think you make make this excellent point in the book that there is the overt imperialism and racism of George W. Bush and his administration, and then the latent imperialism and racism of the Obama years, and both were centered around Islamophobia. But Obama was supposed to be different, and as you've talked about, he quote unquote rejects the Clash of Civilizations thesis. He goes to Cairo, where he gives this new beginning speech. And yet instead, what we see is that it's really, as you write, a desire to put a friendlier face on U.S. imperialism. So what were the implications of that friendlier face? You've talked about the drone strikes. Beyond the drone strikes, I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say something domestically about the implications as well, which is that to the extent that there was opposition to the war on terror, to the US war in Afghanistan and the US war in Iraq, that dissipated after, it dissipated a little bit before Obama came on the scene, but certainly a lot after he did, because there was all this faith that this is our guy, the first Black president in the history of a country built on racial slavery. And so there's just no way he's going to do anything that is, even in the slightest bit racist. And so this must make sense. So it really disarmed liberals and anti-war movements, because there was this faith that somehow he was different and he would do things right. The other way in which it has an impact is domestically. People didn't realize that not only did Obama continue many of Bush's policies, although he did, he ran a smarter war on terror. So some of the silly things that were done in the Bush era, such as the, do you remember the color-coded terror threat?
How could you forget?
Green, where did orange? Yeah.
Okay, so it's a great point about removing the color-coded terror warning chart, which was almost constantly on orange or red, right? I'm reminded now that, and I'm curious, you tease some of this out in the book, that the other thing I believe Obama did was made it even more overt. I'm curious if you agree with this, to see an internal Muslim enemy.
Absolutely.
That during the Obama years became was part of this this latent imperialism in the United States and latent racism.
That's exactly right. So he retired the most clownish kind of programs, like the color-coded terror alert system, which people compared to duck and cover from the Cold War era. But there was a massive shift to the idea of homegrown terrorism, right? Whereas Bush said, we're going to fight them there so that they don't attack us here. Now there was a much deeper emphasis on enemies in our midst. And that really happens in the Obama era, so that his counter-radicalization program, the Countering Violent Extremism, CVE program, is borrowed from the UK. And it's really a system of deputizing certain members of the Muslim community to spy on each other, right? So the whole point of this is there are good Muslims who can help us with our intelligence gathering, and that way we can target the bad Muslims. But if you look at the logic of that, it's the same thing, that somehow Muslims are more prone to carrying out acts of political violence than any other group. Never mind, of course, that even the most mainstream studies that have been done on political violence, particularly the murder of American citizens, shows that the white far right, neo-Nazis and so on, have committed far more murders than people supposedly inspired by jihadist ideology. But there's no corresponding program, right, to go into white communities, white Christian communities, because we know that they produce neo-Nazis, we know that they produced white supremacists and so on. That doesn't exist. But Obama was able, because of his sophistication and his charm, to actually enact a program like this, the CVE program, to recruit coaches and teachers and imams. Never mind, of course, in a couple of years into this program, the very people who were being recruited to spy on their communities were being spied on, for instance, by the FBI or the NYPD and so on. So it's a very dangerous system that he brought into being. It sort of deputizes people to become agents of the national security state. And all that is possible because, you know, he's our guy, he's a Democrat, and he says the right things.
So you brought up a great transition to, this focus on the good Muslims versus the bad Muslims, and us identifying our good Muslims internally. So of course, the Obama years are drawing to an end, and Hillary Clinton is again running for president. And so we're now at the Democratic National Convention. And here comes former President Bill Clinton, the husband of the nominee. And he says in his televised speech, if you are a Muslim and you love America and freedom and hate terror, stay here and help us win and make a future together. We want you. I think this is a remarkable moment in the speech and at the DNC. And I can recall when he said it, I sat up, awake now and almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. But then I did, because as you point out in the book, how is this emblematic of the consistency of Islamophobia among political elites? So again, it seems to fit into this trajectory. I'm curious how you see it. And this is not Trump, by the way. This is not Trump. This is Bill Clinton. This is the Democrats. And if you're a Muslim and you love America, so of course, and freedom and hate terror, think about that combination. Right. Remarkable.
Remarkable. It is remarkable. See, I mean, earlier I said how the range of discussion is so narrow in the political establishment, right, in the United States. And that's where you have it. On the one hand, there is Trump saying he's going to expel all Syrian refugees. And the opposition parties, supposedly the Democrats, say, if you love America, stay here and help us fight the war on terror, which is a fundamentally racist war against, Muslims. Help us fight it better. And if you remember at that moment, Osama, there was also Khizr Khan, who is the father of a fallen soldier who is toured around by the Clinton administration, basically as a way to say, see, we are not racist. We have Muslims as part of our campaign. And here is this man who's willing to stand with Hillary Clinton against the sort of blatant racism of the Trump campaign. But underlying all of that is, again, this notion of good Muslim, bad Muslim, right? Which is that you are good only to the extent that you are willing to go along with the war on terror, whether it is sending your children to die in wars based on lies. In Iraq, for instance, there were no weapons of mass destruction, right? Or it's based on liberating Afghan women, which of course we know is also something that didn't happen. But there's a way in which the Democratic Party is able to capitalize on these sorts of liberal themes, this liberal rights discourse and so on, to try to recruit good Muslims to help prosecute the war on terror. And that's how liberal Islamophobia is different from conservative Islamophobia, which is more about a clash of civilizations, which is different from the right-wing Islamophobia, which is there's a conspiracy by these Muslims to take over the US, they're all evil and so forth. But they're all dialectically connected to one another, and they all influence and shape one another. And the end result of this is to deepen anti-Muslim racism, not simply in terms of practice, but also ideologically in terms of how people think about it.
Wonderful. If you don't mind, let's turn to Donald Trump. And as you describe him, it's much more blatantly racist than previous forms of liberal hegemony. And of course, we see this in the Muslim ban. And what I found particularly telling about the overt Islamophobia of the Trump years was how ahistorical it was. And so, and not about that, Islamophobia is not this way, that Islam is not this way, etc. Because that, of course, but this was all of a sudden Trump decides on a Muslim ban, and then he's very selective in the countries he targets. And so I'm curious, because there's also, as we've talked about, it comes out of now a good 6 to 7 years of deep Islamophobia presented by Fox News, InfoWars, etc. What does this tell us about its rhetorical power, do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that Trump could not have been elected, first of all, and second, could not have garnered, what was it, 80 million votes back in 2020, something in that range, if it hadn't been for the groundwork and the cumulative effect anti-Muslim racism in all its forms, liberal, conservative, and right-wing, had actually laid, right? That laid the basis for somebody like Trump to actually, capitalize on it. And so the way I put it in chapter 7, where I'm talking about the kind of far right-wing Islamophobia that Trump helped to legitimize, and this chapter is really about, analyzing the Islamophobia network, which is a coalition of a number of far right-wing outfits, all of whom have come together, in this project of demonizing Muslims. And so here's how I begin that chapter. The Trump presidency was the most Islamophobic in US history. During Trump's time in office, anti-Muslim racism in its blatant and right-wing form was legitimated, particularly among the tens of millions of his most ardent supporters. After the civil rights movement, Republicans had to resort to dog whistle tactics to appeal to racist voters, but Trump was able to overcome political correctness and to bring overt racism into the mainstream. His bigoted rhetoric and policies created a spike in hate crimes and bias incidents carried out by both state agencies as well as right-wing vigilantes. And so what Trump's election really tells us is that it was finally time for the far right to actually, claim political office, and he appoints many of the most notorious Islamophobes in this Islamophobic network, to positions within his administration, and they push it even further, right, in terms of the policies and so forth.
So that's wonderful, and I couldn't agree with you more about this mix of groups. And I think what's so interesting to me about the Trump period, what I found interesting, horrifying, was we saw this fringe Islamophobic right, which were even on the outside in the sense of the Bush administration. They'd hoped for greater influence.
That's right.
They had some bridges in, folks like Daniel Pipes, et cetera, but were essentially kept at bay, not fully. And the way it was a way to legitimize by keeping them at bay, where they would be invited in, was to kind of show how mainstream, as you put it, mainstream conservative Islamophobia was acceptable and moderate compared to the lunatic fringe. Right. But they found a home in the Trump White House. I mean, it's remarkable, and became and are now mainstream voices. Why do you think they were welcomed not just so readily in the Trump White House, but with all of this discussion? What I found so interesting was the press was filled with discussions about resistance, not normalizing Trump, but Islamophobia, and the fringe Islamophobia right was normalized. Why do you think they were welcomed so readily, especially in the press, et cetera, and think tanks?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that the press operates is, and you, of course, know think tanks better than I do, so I'll let you answer that. But the way the press operates is that they will give legitimacy and they will give space to people who have official positions of power in the political arena. So to the extent, as you correctly pointed out, people like Pipes and so on were kept at the margins, even while they were seen as sort of useful idiots in terms of stoking anti-Muslim sentiment by attacking, the construction of mosques or religious schools or whatever, all of that is useful electorally for the Republicans, and so that will be tolerated, and that will certainly be encouraged as well. But in terms of actually bringing them into office, that was not done to the extent that it was done by the Trump administration. And so what happens is that these people who are on the fringes, some of them, now become appointed to official positions, which gives them access to the mainstream media to be able to spout their views. And that now is no longer something that's fringe and out of the ordinary, but it becomes, oh, well, this official in this capacity is saying this, so it must be true, right? So one of the conspiracy theories that this Islamophobia network has been popularizing is that 80% of mosques teach about violence, and they harbor terrorists and so on. And whereas at an earlier point you could laugh that off as some nonsense coming from think tanks like the Center for CSP, Center for Security Policy, I think, I'm forgetting the exact one, but you could laugh that off and say it's these are just fringe think tanks and so forth. Now they become much more central to the political landscape, which is what allows for the deep polarization that we've seen today, because these people now parade as legitimate sources of information. And of course, there is their whole media. I mean, I analyze this as well, which is that right-wing media, whether you're talking about television, whether you're talking about, the internet and web zines or what have you, there's been a massive proliferation of those networks, which now people turn to as if they are telling the truth. And I'm not saying that the mainstream legacy media are fantastic at doing this, because they're not, but at least the New York Times and CNN and so on will try to verify the information that they get, even if they rely on sources that ultimately legitimate the status quo. But here there's not even a pretense to try to verify any information. And so that's how this process has evolved. But I really want to emphasize how it's a process, right? It didn't just begin one day. It starts much earlier than 9/11, but 9/11 helps to focus it. Obama helps to take the discussion further, and then Trump takes it even further. In other words, it's sort of galloping horse, right? It's like, as long as one party is moving very far to the right, the other tries to keep up with it. And then the whole discourse moves further and further to the right. That said, I do have some hope that there are people who, don't see it that way. They may be a minority, but certainly there have been activist communities in New York City, in the San Francisco Bay Area, who, for instance, there are coalitions that see the police targeting of Black and Latinx people as part of a carceral state that uses these methods as not dissimilar to a national security state that is targeting Muslims and Arabs and South Asians. And so there is a greater recognition among activist communities that everyone is in the same boat, and it's the same institutional apparatus that is targeting everyone. This shouldn't surprise us. This is the last point I'll make about this, which is that there were these things called fusion centers that were created, supposedly to catch Muslim terrorists, and they didn't have a lot of work to do because there aren't that many people of Muslim origin who turn to political violence. And so they expand their dragnet to include Black activists, to include Native American activists. So a Native American activist fighting against the construction of the Keystone Pipeline are targeted using counterterrorism policy, right? So that's how this has worked. And there are increasingly a greater number of people who see that they don't have an interest in counterterrorism policy, because what starts off getting used against Muslims then gets expanded to be used against Occupy Wall Street activists, against Black and brown people, against anti-war activists, and so forth.
So you mentioned this already, and this is part of a longer conversation you and I have had, but in the past 2 months, we've now watched a kind of after Afghanistan was effectively absent from media coverage for 18 of the 20 years, if not 19 of the 20 years. There's been a reemergence of discussions of Afghanistan, even though that's also dissipated, but more attention paid now to saving Afghan women. And I'm curious how, and you've written about this and you talk about this, how this plays into the broader notions of Islamophobia, and why it's such fertile ground, but of course why it was also absent for so long from the discussion.
So one of the ways in which the Afghan war is sold, not just to people in the United States, but around the world, is that the US is going to go off and rescue Afghan women, right? So you start to see Sherry Blair in the UK, Tony Blair's wife, making this argument. You start to see Laura Bush being brought into the mainstream, and many such figures who are arguing that the war on terror is really a war for the liberation of women, for human rights, and so forth. And the unfortunate reality is that vast majorities actually accept this, clash of civilizations rhetoric and the idea that somehow the West is going to go off and liberate poor Afghan women. And so a study I did of news media coverage of this shows that whereas the suffering of Afghan women under the Taliban, which actually, the attack on women's rights in Afghanistan begins in the 90s. Let's not forget that in the 80s, before that, Afghan women were very much part of the public sphere. They wrote, they were involved in writing the constitution and so forth. This is particularly true of women in the city centers and so forth. But anyway, that's not newsworthy back in the 1990s, right? Suddenly, when the US is getting ready to go to war, we have hundreds of news media accounts of their suffering, and even women's studies departments accept this, right? You would think that scholars of women's studies would reject this imperial feminist narrative, but unfortunately, they have bought it hook, line, and sinker. Never mind, of course, that Afghan women were far from liberated, right? So now there is some good work that's done by some NGOs. There are some developments initially that are, favorable in the city. And keep in mind that 70% of Afghan women live in the countryside. But by and large, this is according to the US government itself. I wrote a piece in Truth Out where I cite the National Intelligence Council report from April 2021, where they state that while some policies that negatively impacted Afghan women ended after the fall of the Taliban in the early 2000s, and I'm going to quote them, quote, many continued in practice, even in government-controlled areas, that is, US-backed government, and years of war have left millions of women maimed, widowed, impoverished, and displaced, end quote. So in other words, this was a rhetorical strategy used to convince people to give their consent to the war on terror. And the reality, of course, is completely different from that. And in the book, I also go through how this rhetoric of imperial feminism and colonial feminism, and I cite all the scholars who have done this work, begins again in the high point of European colonialism in the 19th century, where there's a gendered dimension to Orientalism, right? And you see Lord Cromer claiming that he's going to liberate Egyptian women. You see the French claiming to liberate Algerian women through these staged spectacles of removing their burqas and so forth. But of course, that is not the case. In fact, in Algeria, after the spectacle, the veil becomes a symbol of resistance and is the means through which paramilitary action is carried out. So yeah, there's a very strong gendered dimension, and it's something that we must think about very seriously.
This is wonderful. I can't thank you enough. I know you're not feeling well, and so I thank you for coming on. I want to hold up a copy of your book again, Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, the new 20th anniversary of 9/11 edition. It's updated. Dr. Deepa Kumar, thank you so much for taking the time, and this is wonderful. And we hope to have you back here at Syracuse when the new book comes out, and for in person and for a very lively discussion. So thank you again.
Thank you for your excellent questions, Osama. It's always good to come to Syracuse and to learn from you, and I really value your work, so thank you for that as well.